Hi everyone. What a fantastic day outside. I thought I'd stop by and review this week's lecture specific to our core element on metrics, rewards, and recognitions. Of course, throughout my presentation, you'll hear the sounds and the calls of my cat, so I apologize for that in advance. Let's get started. So again, today's lecture is really all about the third core element of our ecosystem, which is metrics, rewards, and recognition. And if you look at the top, very important three concepts. Manage what you measure. Very important to leadership. Whatever is important to you, you need to manage it, and you need to measure whatever is important to you. Second, people behave differently when they know you are keeping score. That's just a fact of life. If people understand what is important to you and you're keeping score of that, they will behave differently, or at least hopefully so. Third important concept is shape behavior and norms using metrics that drive appropriate incentives. And this is really key to our discussion on this core element, is what drives incentives. You need to create incentives that will help shape behavior and norms, help shape the behavior and norms you are looking for. What helps you in determining those incentives? Metrics, measurements. So you start with what is important to you. What are those behaviors and norms that are important to you? How can you measure that using metrics? And as you're measuring that, then what incentives are most likely to influence those behaviors and norms? So that's what this week is really all about. So when we take a look at metrics, rewards, and recognition, what's also important to know is that measurements build accountability. Build accountability not only with leadership, but also with other employees. If you want to build accountability, there's a lot you can do. What you must understand about accountability is you cannot force accountability on people. You only create an environment where they willingly accept accountability. So again, we're talking about crafting that ecosystem, crafting that environment where they will accept accountability. And metrics is key to that. And you're going to see that metrics are key elements of a comprehensive ecosystem transformative strategy. And that's key. You want to transform the ecosystem, you need to look at metrics. When I took over my position as CHRO at Byrne Dairy, turnover is 57%. They couldn't tell me exactly what the turnover was until I started, and then I sifted through all the data, and it was 57%. That was my number one key metric. And I was able to break down that metric by position, title, by location. We had several locations at that time. And as I assigned locations to specific HR staff, that HR staff would also now be responsible for tracking that metric, communicating it to that location leadership. We needed to transform our strategy when it came to retention and turnover. The first step in doing that is what is it that's important and how do you track that? So that was communicated, that turnover metric was communicated monthly. And we developed a series of other related metrics. And then goals were established specific to those metrics to bring those metrics down. And then for the goals, action items, all very important. So the roadmap of metrics provide the leader with insight, and it reveals several things: the necessary guidance for achieving and sustaining improvement, and a nudge to workforce accountability. Once I implemented those turnover metrics, not only to the HR staff, but as communicated to local leadership, they now became accountable for it. And if they succeeded, there was an incentive. If they didn't succeed, there was a sanction, a disincentive. But you have to start with what is the behavior you're looking for, how do you measure it, then you create incentives around that. Action is required. For the effective leader, you have to act on these two areas: building a balanced scorecard and the use of incentives. A balanced scorecard is for an individual or a department or a location or a function, a bevy of metrics that, I'll just pick a number. Maybe you have 10 metrics that are very important, critical, that reflect those 10 major behaviors or norms. You then report those on a monthly basis, but you weight each of those somehow in terms of importance, and you create a balanced scorecard. When I create a balanced scorecards, whether it be for an individual or a location or a function, I always weighted those critical metrics so that it would balance out to perfection being 100%. Similar to like a grade, right, in school. So if a location scored 60% on their balanced scorecard, they were not hitting their metrics and their goals. Likewise, if it was 90, 95%, they were doing a great job. So the balanced scorecard is not only taking what's important, not only saying you've measured it, but now you're beginning to prioritize what is important. Some things are more important than other things, let's face it. Now, the balanced scorecard, a strategic tool for management. It really reinforces accountability. It's a critical tool for developing that, and it helps leaders to focus on both the short-term and long-term organizational goals. And that's critical because there are goals aligned for each metric on the balanced scorecard. You also have capabilities. The balanced scorecard enables leaders to track not just the financial results, but also those capabilities that determine their ability to grow and execute their strategies. So within the balanced scorecard, you want to build in capabilities. One of the capabilities, for example, in a manufacturer, is to take a look at key positions. And in a manufacturing environment, a mechanical ability is a key position. So you monitor the performance of your mechanical staff, your maintenance staff. You monitor their skills. And then goals. The balanced scorecard is going to enable the organization to track its overall progress by managing performance in relation to short-term and long-term goals. Always remember, short-term goals tend to focus on financial performance. Your long-term goals always tend to focus on value creation and competitive differentiation. So building your balanced scorecard is a tool for strategic management. And in order to do that, you follow these steps. What to measure? You need to identify those measurements that you're going to track and report that are going to align with the goals you want to go out and enact. You're going to ask your manager about what it is that's important that you have to measure. You're going to ask other stakeholders, could be customers and employees. Next, how to measure and report. We need to craft an infrastructure to capture the data, but then you need to weigh the data to create what is critical and then report the information. What's key here is that you never want to create an infrastructure that is overly burdensome. My monthly report at Burn, SCHRO, was about 45 pages. It was extensive. It was number after number. But I made sure that as I built that report over the 8.5 years, that the data was easily accessed by the creators of the report, which was the HR staff. And then you have to add flavor to the data. You have to understand the differences between the data and information. And we kind of mentioned that in prior lectures. You need to understand the difference between data and information. Data, raw numbers. Information is interpretation of the data. It is subjective, but that is the flavor that you add. For example, in a location, your turnover could be going down. However, if you peel back the layers of the turnover, you may find that even though your turnover is going down overall, maybe your turnover of maintenance staff, those who are mechanically inclined, is going up. So now you have to be very careful in how you talk about the overall turnover, because again, remember, you always want to focus on capabilities. Now, I was also in charge of Syracuse Cold Storage, which was for Burn Dairy, the warehouse at the time. And some of our key metrics you'll see here: carrying cost of inventory, inventory turnover, inventory to sales ratio, inventory accuracy, inventory shrinkage, and order lead time. And there was a lot of interplay within here. If one of those metrics were off, it would, over time, influence other metrics. And of course, we had many more metrics specific to turnover and the human element of the warehouse. Very, very important. Our next focus is that metrics, rewards, and recognition. Not all metrics and measurements are created equal. So the leader must know what a key metric is. So what makes a number key? The leader simply cannot pick just any number and call it a metric, let alone consider it important. For a metric to be important, it must meet one of three criteria. And for me, it must meet, usually, my goal was 2 or more of the criteria. Directly connected to the financials. So improve the key number and you get better financial results. That is critical. That is something that every leader has to focus on. Financials. Whatever you're doing here must help your financials here, because at the end of the day, if you don't have good financials, you don't have an organization, let's face it. Second, the key number has to align with your goals. And again, there's going to be a relationship between goals and metrics and key numbers. A number is key if it tells the story about a specific goal. So now you may ask yourself, what comes first, the metric or the goal? Well, what comes first is what is important. Then from there, how are you going to measure it? Take a look at then developing some goals. Does that measurement align with the goal? And what makes a key number? It's not necessarily imposed from on high. Consult with managers, employee teams, and other stakeholders to develop their key numbers, but ask yourself, what are the biggest challenges we are facing this year? The biggest opportunities? How can our unit measure its contribution? So you need to develop this. Don't wait for your boss to push it down to you. You want to be proactive. Great leaders are proactive. And fourth, what makes a number key? In the now, not forever. Very, very important. And you'll see that here. Ecosystems change. They're constantly evolving in this business environment of disruption. Sometimes revenue growth is the top priority. Other times profitability or cash flow. When an organization makes progress on one objective, it may want to set its sight on another the following year or maybe the following month. So you want to see if that metric, if what is important in the now, understanding that the now is not forever. Our next focus is on rewards, incentives, recognition, being helpful when placed in context. There's a symbiotic relationship between metrics and incentives. They have to align as well as goals. What is the symbiotic dynamic between metrics and rewards? Metrics can provide key data on current performance. Always remember, the data and the information is on current performance and actually probably past performance, because usually that metric is telling you what happened just recently. But translating these data into action requires accountability and innovation. It requires forward thinking by the leader. Thoughtful use of financial and non-financial incentives is essential for sharing that accountability and a drive for improvement. So metrics are telling you where you have been, and through your forward thinking, are you trending in the right direction? And then you think about what are the rewards and the incentives to keep you going in that right direction. You put those incentives in place, you're still measuring, and hopefully the metrics continue to tell you that those incentives are working and you're headed in the right direction. But let's talk about that incentive infrastructure. An incentive infrastructure detailed observations of the financial and non-financial incentive systems, and they show the following: one size does not fit all, and educate and inform. Let's look at each. One size does not fit all. There is no ideal incentive system that is appropriate for every organization, for every ecosystem. Non-financial. You got organizations that'll have long histories and they've developed ecosystems. They can use non-financial incentives such as peer pressure with great effectiveness. So those organizations that have histories that have been around don't necessarily have to rely on financial incentives. They can rely on non-financial incentives. While financial, organizations that are earlier in their journey, they might need financial incentives for simple goals. So when you were talking about the incentive infrastructure, you have to look at the non-financial and financial rewards and incentives. And keep in mind, recognition, plain recognition, pat on the back from leader to employee is not financial, but it can be as powerful. Very, very important. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind is don't overly rely on the financial. If you begin to overly rely on the financial, it becomes an entitlement. Employees view it as an entitlement and it loses its power to be an incentive. So be very, very careful. And secondly, we want to educate and inform. Incentive systems should be understood by all. They are a means to an end where the end is shaping behavior and driving goal attainment. They are not an entitlement. We had a great incentive program at Byrne. We called it Teams. And it was quarterly. So we didn't do it at the end of the year. We did it every quarter. And it was well communicated. Every person had their personal goals. Then they had goals for the team they were in. Then there were company goals. And depending on the grade that you got for the three, that would determine what a bonus would be for you, a cash bonus for each quarter. If the company wasn't doing well, chances are you weren't going to get a bonus because you didn't have any money to pay, even if the team was doing well or if you were doing well. Let's say the company was doing well and you were doing well, but your team was not doing well. Your bonus would be diminished because of that. So we tried to integrate all three. Wasn't easy, but after a while, people understood that it wasn't an entitlement. There would be some quarters when you would not get a bonus in that, yes, the individual performance was important, but as important was the team performance. And those were some of the behaviors and norms we were looking for. What leaders need to convey in um, an incentive infrastructure is context, humility, and flexibility. For context, data and incentives are being used for improvement, not judgment. Okay? If you don't hit your target that quarter, fine. We understand. That's going to happen. We're not going to judge you as an individual. Okay? We are using the data and the incentives to make sure that you understand what is important. Data and incentives should always be viewed, communicated as part of an effort to improve performance. And leaders can promote clarity about the goal of the incentive program by sharing actual stories that put the data in context. So at Byrne, when we had teams that did not get a bonus, usually because the team goals were not met, the team would get together. They would talk about it. They would discuss ways to try to improve team performance. Now, it wasn't perfect, and yes, you're going to have some team members that were angry because, hey, I did it. I did what I was supposed to do. The team did not. So it's important that you always have that clarity of the goal of the incentive program and share stories. That team that wasn't successful that quarter, the leader would say, hey, we were successful the quarter before, and we were successful the quarter before because. Very important. Humility. Leadership humility is an essential component of any effective incentive strategy. Why? No measures define the ideal state in every situation. No data set is ever complete, and risk adjustment is never perfect. So the leader has to understand all of that, has to communicate that, cannot simply say, it is what it is. Not going to fly. The implications of data can always be questioned by skeptics. Again, why the leader has to show humility about the metrics and the incentive program. The norm should always be to use reasonable data to guide improvement. Again, very important. When we first started the team's incentive program at Byrne, before we rolled it out, we made sure that employees reviewed the measurements, how they were going to be measured individually and as a team. They didn't have say into how the company would be measured. That was primarily all financials. But we wanted to make sure that they felt and they believed that the measurements were reasonable. We had one situation that I can recall where we started out, initially it was reasonable. We had a group of drivers, and one of the team goals was there could be no accidents in a quarter. If there was an accident, no bonus. Well, sometimes during the winter, accidents happen. It's not the fault of the driver. So we had to tweak that goal so that it was reasonable. So you want to make sure that reasonable data is used. And flexibility. This is absolutely key because neither the data nor the incentive strategy structures will ever be perfect. At Byrne, we were constantly changing our team's goals, and we would change our company financial goals. Why? The environment's dynamic. And leadership must be open to revisiting the incentive program as needed after receiving reasonable input from personnel. Very important that when you are looking at an incentive infrastructure, the leader has to convey context, humility, and flexibility. Now, there are going to always be some pitfalls, and there's pitfalls with financial incentives, right? One of the pitfalls, how do you award it? How do you define what is good enough? Next, too easy to measure, a misplaced focus on metrics that are easily measured but not meaningful. Measurable actions, right? We do tend to gravitate toward easy to measure performance metrics. Try to use what we're already using as a way of saying, well, that's important, when in fact it may not be. Bad benchmarks. And here the question is, so what are we trying to really incentivize? So you want to make sure that the metric and the incentive aligned with the behavior and the norm. Realistic, again, you want goals to be realistic and reasonable and aspirational, and focus, diminish focus on issues that are not tied to financial incentives. So you want to be focused on critical financial incentives. The use of non-financial incentives and the pitfalls there. Well, not really a lot of pitfalls. In fact, they can be very powerful, and leadership should always really focus on here. A great area is what is referred to as appreciative inquiry. And let's spend some time and just take a look at that. With appreciative inquiry, team members discuss incidents which made them proud, can help identify the features that capture us at our best, norms and systems, strengths over weaknesses. So having an opportunity to discuss incidents where the individuals or the teams have done a super job, and to sort of debrief on that is very, very critical. Why? It will reaffirm the norms and systems we're trying to focus on, and it will really focus on our strengths over weaknesses. You have to look at weaknesses, but we tend to sometimes look more at the weaknesses than our strengths. Appreciative inquiry helps us in this matter. Use of stories or comments, very important. Internal sharing of data on performance, very important. Storytelling, listening. Leaders must listen to stories told by staff, very critical. Transparency. Leadership transparency has its greatest impact on staff who are being transparent. So a leader's transparency reaffirms their transparency. If the leader is transparent, the employee will be transparent. Teams, having a team who works closely together, bring peer pressure to life is helpful. Nothing wrong with peer pressure if it is respectful. Very, very critical. Within a well-functioning team, staff values their colleagues' respect and would never want to disappoint them. That's the kind of peer pressure we're talking about with non-financial incentives. And customer involvement. Having customers on committees will help. It helps to exert a powerful influence on staff. Again, non-financial incentive. So when crafting the incentive infrastructure, you want to take a look at both financial incentives and non-financial incentives and align them with, again, what is important to you, how those important items are being measured, the metrics, how they're being communicated and reported. Now, what's interesting are a couple of incentive mechanisms that I have included here. And I'm not going to walk you through them, but I want you to spend some time. And as you read through what is within the lecture notes, think about, is what that organization did a good thing? Think about the benefits of that incentive infrastructure. Think about the negatives of that incentive infrastructure, because again, they're not all equal. And maybe it would work for an organization here, maybe not for an organization over here, or even for the organization where you work. Kronos had what they referred to as a 60-40 bonus rule, and you will see that listed here. Was it effective for them? Yes. Is it effective for every organization? No. Think about what kind of metrics that they would need to make this work, and what were the important items that they were looking to achieve. When we talk about incentives and we talk about bonuses, especially financial incentives, one of the greatest examples of a financial incentive gone awry is at Wells Fargo, where they financially tried to incentivize account reps at Wells Fargo for increasing the number of accounts. The goals that they established in order for an account rep to receive the financial incentive were very unrealistic, and as a result, many account reps went about pursuing their goals through unethical behavior. It cost Wells Fargo dearly. So a classic example of here's what's important to us, more accounts. How do we go about doing it? And if you set unreasonable goals and you attach to it a financial incentive, you may not get the result you're looking for. And then we have another example here by Harman, where they attempted to sort of bring all the groups together into a larger organization. So again, take a look at that and just ask yourself, was it effective? Maybe yes. Would it have been effective for the organization you work or another organization? What would the advantages be? What would the disadvantages be? And look at the disadvantages in a very strict sense. Every incentive infrastructure is always going to have, wow, that's great. It's always going to have, well, could be a problem. What is the problem, or what are the problems? How are you going to address that moving forward? So hopefully you found our discussion helpful. But again, let's sort of recap and focus on the three critical items. Always manage what you measure. Why? Because that is what is important. But you have to measure what is important. Always know that people will behave differently when they know you are keeping score, and if there's an incentive attached to it. Now, that incentive can be financial or non-financial. And that you shape behavior and norms using metrics that drive appropriate incentives. Start out by what's important to me in terms of behaviors and norms. How can I measure that? Then when I have that dynamic, what is the incentive infrastructure I can build that aligns with that? And within all of that are goals. Again, hopefully this is helpful. Again, have a wonderful day and be safe always. Thank you.